Chapter 20. Special Problems in the National Economy. Demagoguery beats data in making public policy. Congressman Dick Armey. Economic decisions affect more than the economy. They affect the scope of government power and the growth of government financial obligations, including, but not limited to, the national debt. There are also sometimes misconceptions of the nature of government, leading to unrealistic demands being made on it, followed by hasty denunciations of the stupidity or irrationality of government officials when those demands are not met. To understand many issues in the national economy requires some understanding of political processes as well as economic processes. The scope of government. While some decisions are clearly political decisions and others are clearly economic decisions, there are large areas where choices can be made through either process. Both the government and the marketplace can supply housing, transportation, education, and many other things. For those decisions that can be made either politically or economically, it is necessary not only to decide which particular outcome would be preferred, but also which process offers the best prospect of actually reaching that outcome. This in turn requires understanding how each process works in practice, under their respective incentives and constraints, rather than how they should work ideally. The public can express their desires either through choices made in the voting booth or choices made in the marketplace. However, political choices are offered less often and are usually binding until the next election. Moreover, the political process offers package deal choices, where one candidate's whole spectrum of positions on economic, military, environmental, and other issues must be accepted or rejected as a whole, in comparison with another candidate's spectrum of positions on the same range of issues. The voter may prefer one candidate's position on some of these issues and another candidate's position on other issues, but no such choice is available on election day. By contrast, consumers make their choices in the marketplace every day and can buy one company's milk and another company's cheese, or ship some packages by Federal Express and other packages by United Parcel Service. Then they can change their minds a day or a week later and make wholly different choices. As a practical matter, virtually no one puts as much time and close attention into deciding whether to vote for one candidate rather than another, as is usually put into deciding what job to take, or where to rent an apartment, or buy a house. Moreover, the public usually buys finished products in the marketplace, but can choose only among competing promises in the political arena. In the marketplace, the strawberries or car you are considering buying are right before your eyes when you make your decision, while the policies that a candidate promises to follow must be accepted more or less on faith, and the eventual consequences of those policies still more so. Speculation is just one aspect of a market economy, but it is the essence of elections. On the other hand, each voter has the same single vote on election day, whereas consumers have very different amounts of dollars with which to express their desires in the marketplace. However, these dollar differences may even out somewhat over a lifetime, as the individual moves from one income bracket to another over the years, although the differences are there as of any given time. The influence of wealth in the marketplace makes many prefer to move decisions into the political arena, on the assumption that this is a more level playing field. However, among the things that wealth buys is more and better education, as well as more leisure time that can be devoted to political activities and the mastering of legal technicalities. All this translates into a disproportionate influence of wealthier people in the political process, while the fact that those who are not rich often have more money in the aggregate than those who are, may give ordinary people more weight in the market than in the political or legal arena, depending on the issue and the circumstances. Too often there has been a tendency to regard government as a monolithic decision-maker, or as the public interest personified. But different elements within the government respond to different outside constituencies, and are often in opposition to one another for that reason, as well as because of jurisdictional frictions among themselves. Many things done by government officials in response to the particular incentives and constraints of the situations in which they find themselves may be described as irrational by observers, but are often more rational than the assumption that these officials represent the public interest personified. Politicians like to come to the rescue of particular industries, professions, classes, or racial or ethnic groups, from whom votes or financial support can be expected, and to represent the benefits to these groups as net benefits to the country. Such tendencies are not confined to any given country, but can be found in modern democratic states around the world. As a writer in India put it, politicians lack the courage to privatize the huge loss-making public sector because they are afraid to lose the vote of organized labor. They resist dismantling subsidies for power, fertilizer, and water because they fear the crucial farm vote. They won't touch food subsidies because of the massive poor vote. They will not remove thousands of inspectors in the state governments who continuously harass private businesses because they don't want to alienate government servants' vote bank. Meanwhile, these giveaways play havoc with state finances and add to our disgraceful fiscal deficit. Unless the deficit comes under control, the nation will not be more competitive, nor will the growth rate rise further to 8 and 9%, which is what is needed to create jobs and improve the chances of the majority of our people to actualize their capabilities in a reasonably short time. While such problems may be particularly acute in India, they are by no means confined to India. In 2002, the Congress of the United States passed a farm subsidy bill, with bipartisan support, that has been estimated to cost the average American family more than $4,000 in inflated food prices over the following decade. Huge financial problems have been created in Brazil by such generous pensions to government employees that they can retire in a better economic condition than when they were working. One of the pressures on governments in general, and elected governments in particular, is to do something, even when there is nothing they can do that is likely to make things better, and much that they can do that will risk making things worse. Economic processes, like other processes, take time, but politicians may be unwilling to allow these processes the time to run their course, especially when their political opponents are advocating quick fixes, such as wage and price controls during the Nixon administration, or restrictions on international trade during the Great Depression of the 1930s. In the 21st century, it is virtually impossible, politically, for any American government to allow a recession to run its course, as American governments once did for more than 150 years prior to the Great Depression, when both Republican President Herbert Hoover and then Democratic President Franklin D. Roosevelt intervened on an unprecedented scale. Today, it is widely assumed as axiomatic that the government must do something when the economy turns down. Very seldom does anyone compare what actually happens when the government does something to what has happened when the government did nothing. The Great Depression. While the stock market crash of October 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression of the 1930s have often been seen as examples of the failure of market capitalism, it is by no means certain that the stock market crash made mass unemployment inevitable. Nor does history show better results when the government decides to do something compared to what happens when the government does nothing. Although unemployment rose in the wake of the record-setting stock market crash of 1929, the unemployment rate peaked at 9% 2 months after the crash, and then began a trend generally downward, falling to 6.3% in June 1930. Unemployment never reached 10% for any of the 12 months following the stock market crash of 1929. But after a series of major and unprecedented government interventions, the unemployment rate soared over 20% for 35 consecutive months. These interventions began under President Herbert Hoover, featuring the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930, the highest tariffs in well over a century, designed to reduce imports so that more American-made products would be sold, thereby providing more employment for American workers. It was a plausible belief, as so many things done by politicians seem plausible. but a public statement signed by 1,000 economists at leading universities around the country warned against these tariffs, saying that the Smoot-Hawley bill would not only fail to reduce unemployment, but would be counterproductive. None of this, however, dissuaded Congress from passing this legislation, or dissuaded President Hoover from signing it into law June 1930. Within 5 months, the unemployment rate reversed its decline and rose to double digits for the first time in the 1930s, and it never fell below that level for any month during the entire remainder of that decade, as one massive government intervention after another proved to be either futile or counterproductive. What of the track record when the government refused to do something to counter a downturn in the economy? Since the massive federal intervention under President Hoover was unprecedented, the whole period between the nation's founding in 1776 and the 1929 stock market crash was essentially a do-nothing era as far as federal intervention to counter a downturn. No downturn during that long era was as catastrophic as the Great Depression of the 1930s became, after massive government intervention under both the Hoover administration and the Roosevelt administration that followed. Yet there was a downturn in the economy in 1921 that was initially more severe than the downturn in the 12 months immediately following the stock market crash of October 1929. Unemployment in the first year of President Warren G. Harding's administration was 11.7%. Yet Harding did nothing except reduce government spending as tax revenues declined, the very opposite of what would later be advocated by Keynesian economists. The following year, unemployment fell to 6.7%, and the year after that to 2.4%. Even after it became a political axiom, following the Great Depression of the 1930s, that the government had to intervene when the economy turned down, that axiom was ignored by President Ronald Reagan when the stock market crashed in 1987, breaking the record for a one-day decline that had been set back in 1929. Despite outraged media reaction at his failure to act, President Reagan let the economy recover on its own. The net result was an economy that, in fact, recovered on its own, followed by what the economist later called 20 years of an enviable combination of steady growth and low inflation. These were not controlled experiments, of course, so any conclusions must be suggestive rather than definitive. But at the very least, the historical record calls into question whether a stock market crash must lead to a long and deep depression. It also calls into question the larger issue whether it was the market or the government that failed in the 1930s, and whether a do-something policy must produce a better result than a do-nothing policy. Monetary policy. Even a nominally independent agency like the Federal Reserve System in the United States operates under the implicit threat of new legislation that can both counter its existing policies and curtail its future independence. In 1979, the distinguished economist Arthur F. Burns, a former chairman of the Federal Reserve System, looked back on the efforts of the Federal Reserve under his chairmanship to try to cope with a growing inflation. As the Federal Reserve kept testing and probing the limits of its freedom, he said, it repeatedly evoked violent criticism from both the executive establishment and the Congress, and therefore had to devote much of its energy to warding off legislation that could destroy any hope of ending inflation. More fundamental than the problems that particular monetary policies may cause is the difficulty of crafting any policies with predictable outcomes in complex circumstances, when the responses of millions of other people to their perception of a policy can have consequences as serious as the policy itself. Economic problems that are easy to solve as theoretical exercises can be far more challenging in the real world. Merely estimating the changing dimensions of the problem is not easy. Federal Reserve forecasts of inflation during the 1960s and 1970s underestimated how much inflation was developing under the chairmanship of both William McChesney, Martin, and Arthur F. Burns. But during the subsequent chairmanships of Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan, the Federal Reserve overestimated what the rate of inflation would be. Even a successful monetary policy is enveloped in uncertainties. Inflation, for example, was reduced from a dangerous 13% per year in 1979 to a negligible 2% by 2003. But this was done through a series of trial and error monetary actions, some of which proved to be effective, some ineffective, and all with painful repercussions on the viability of businesses and on unemployment among workers. As the Federal Reserve tightened money and credit in the early 1980s in order to curb inflation, unemployment rose, while bankruptcies and business failures rose to levels not seen in decades. During this process, Federal Reserve System Chairman Paul Volcker was demonized in the media, and President Ronald Reagan's popularity plummeted in the polls for supporting him. But at least Volcker had the advantage that Professor Burns had not had, of having support in the White House. However, not even those who had faith that the Federal Reserve's monetary policy was the right one for dealing with rampant inflation had any way of knowing how long it would take, or whether Congress's patience would run out before then, leading to legislation restricting the Fed's independent authority. One of the governors of the Federal Reserve System during that time later reported his own reactions. Did I get sweaty palms? Did I lie awake at night? The answer is that I did both. I was speaking before these groups all the time, home builders and auto dealers and others. It's not so bad when some guy gets up and yells at you, "You SOB, you're killing us." What really got to me was when this fellow stood up and said in a very quiet way, "Governor, I've been an auto dealer for 30 years, worked hard to build up that business. Next week I am closing my doors." And then he sat down. That really gets to you. The tensions experienced by those who had the actual responsibility for dealing with the real-world problem of inflation were in sharp contrast with the serene self-confidence of many economists in previous years, who believed that economics had reached the point where economists could not merely deal in a general way with recession or inflation problems, but could even fine-tune the economy in normal times. The recommendations and policies of such confident economists had much to do with creating the inflation that the Federal Reserve was now trying to cope with. As a later economist and columnist, Robert J. Samuelson, put it, "As we weigh our economic prospects, we need to recall the lessons of the Great Inflation. Its continuing significance is that it was a self-inflicted wound, something we did to ourselves, with the best of intentions and on the most impeccable of advice. Its intellectual godfathers were, without exception, men of impressive intelligence. They were credentialed by some of the nation's outstanding universities, Yale, MIT, Harvard, Princeton. But their high intellectual standing did not make their ideas any less impractical or destructive. Scholars can have tunnel vision, constricted by their own political or personal agendas. Like politicians, they can also yearn for power and celebrity of the public arena. Even if their intentions are pure, their ideas may be mistaken. Academic pedigree alone is no guarantor of useful knowledge and wisdom."